1 Kings chapter 18 as we finish our series this morning on Elijah and fire and rain and revival from 1 Kings chapter 17, 18, and 19 this morning. 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 41, Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of abundance of rain." So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Carmel. Then he bowed down on the ground and put his face between his knees, said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So he went up and looked and said, "There's nothing." 7 times he said, "Go again." Then it came to pass the 7th time that he said, "There's a cloud as small as a man's hand rising up out of the sea." So he said, "Go up and say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. So Ahab rode away, went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Sometimes, and I've said this throughout this series, sometimes revival is hard to define. It may be that as we pray for revival, God may answer our prayers in ways that we don't expect or even realize. We may be in the midst of a movement of God that we are unaware of. Great blessings, what I'm wanting to say this morning is that great blessings often arise out of very, very small beginnings. Zechariah 4 and verse 10 is a verse I wish you would remember. It says, "Who has despised the day of small beginnings?" Who has despised the day of small beginnings? I'll give you an illustration before we even get into the message. We love to sing a song at Christmas time called "O Little Town of Bethlehem. How still we see thee lie. Yet in thy dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight." I would remind you that the night that Jesus Christ was born in Bethlehem, nobody in Bethlehem knew anything had happened. Was that a significant event for the life of the world, for all of eternity? Yes, it was. And I promise you that people, I don't know what Bethlehem looked like or where it was or where, we don't know anything about it, but across the street from where the manger was, nobody knew that anything had happened. Maybe they heard a little bit of noise and wondered what all the ruckus was about, people coming to visit at late hours of the night, if anyone did. We don't even know how that really happened. God is always at work. Dr. Henry Blackaby said it's our job to find out where he's working and join him in that work. It looked like a small hand of a man rising up out of the sea, a little cloud the size of a man's hand. In reality, it was the hand of God. That little cloud appeared and soon covered the entire sky. Well, let me tell you a couple things that we need to look for as we think about revival. First of all, let's talk about Elijah one last time and remind you of Elijah's humanity. James chapter 5 and verse 17 says that Elijah was a man subject to passions as we are, a man just like us. And he had just had a great victory on Mount Carmel. The drought was about to come to an end. The rain had started to fall. Elijah may have been riding high, and he was for a while. We see in verses 41 through 46 how he outran the chariots of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. He was high on adrenaline, you can imagine. But now we come to chapter 19, and he's threatened and intimidated by Jezebel. In chapter 17 and verse 1, we found him hiding under a tree. God said, "Go hide yourself." In chapter 19, we find him hiding under a broom tree. Here's the bold prophet on Mount Carmel, chapter 18 and verse 27, verse 32, 38, taunting, gloating doing a little victory dance over the, a little dance over the prophets of Baal as he mocked them. Put 850 prophets to death, and now he's hiding from a woman. How scary must she have been? 2 Kings chapter 9 and verse 30 says that she painted her eyes. I've heard preachers talk about her war paint. You remember Peter, the night Jesus was betrayed, in a moment of great boldness as he stood next to Jesus, whipped out his sword and cut off the centurion's ear. And then a few brief moments later was frightened when a little girl asked him if he knew who Jesus was. Elijah, we would expect, would have been bold enough to stand up to Jezebel. I'm reminded of Chrysostom, who said to Eudoxia, the empress who threatened him with death, "Go tell her, I fear nothing but sin." That's a great statement, isn't it? Basil said to Valens, the Arian emperor who was threatening him with death, "I wish he would, and I'd go to heaven sooner." Martin Luther said, "I care neither for the Pope's favor nor his fury." We're told, don't fear the emperor. He has no power except from God. Isn't it interesting how we name our children today after the disciples? Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Lucas, my grandson, Andrew, Simon. We name our dogs after Caesar, Nero, Brutus. God's not through here. But in this moment, we see Elijah's definite humanity. We see James 5:17 demonstrated that he was a man of like passions like we are. He was weak. He was afraid. At this moment, he was tired. He was burned out. And so we see his humanity. Secondly, I want us to look at his complaint. He is fleeing from Jezebel to Beersheba. That's about 100 miles from Jezreel in Judah. He left his servant there and went another day's journey into the wilderness. And he sat down, the Bible says, under a broom tree, and he wept. Let me read it. 1 Kings chapter 19. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more so, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." When he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came down and sat under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die. He said, "It's enough now, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my father's." Then as he lay and slept under the broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." And he looked and he saw by his head there was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came in to him a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights, as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. Behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah, what are you doing here?" He said, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant and torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they're seeking to take my life." Hiding. Verse 11, then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But you know the Lord wasn't in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. The Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. Remember the fire that fell from heaven 40 days earlier? This time the Lord wasn't in the fire. After the fire, there was, say it with me, a still, small voice. Elijah was a man like us, and Elijah fainted. Why did he faint? The Bible tells us in Luke chapter 18 and verse 1, men ought always to pray and not to faint. Well, Elijah prayed, didn't he? He prayed once and he prayed again. We've been saying throughout this whole series that his life can be summarized by those words. He prayed. What happened when he stopped praying? He should have prayed again. Verse 4, he did. He said, Lord, take my life. It'd be better if I was dead. What a dumb prayer that was. You ever pray that way? Well, you know, I imagine when Elijah got to heaven, stood before God, he may have said, Lord, did you really have to put that one in the Bible? He could have, should have quit while he was ahead. No, it's there so that we know that he was a man just like us with feet of clay. What foolishness. What foolishness. Number one, foolishness. Psalm 14 and verse 1. He forgot God. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. He forgot about God. He failed in the area of his greatest strength, in the area of prayer. He did pray, but this time it was a really stupid prayer. Why was he running? You know, here's the thing. Lord, take my life. I'd rather be dead. You know, it's not good for me to continue living. So what's he doing? He's running away from a woman who promised to kill him. My dad used to say, if he really wanted to die, why didn't he just stay there? Jezebel promised him a Class A funeral. But here he is, whimpering and whining. You know, all too often, prayer becomes a last resort. We really don't believe it. You know, look at the question here. In verse 9, God says, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? You don't belong here. It's not where you're supposed to be. Elijah was a man with a like nature as ours. He prayed earnestly that it might not rain. It didn't rain on the earth for 3 years and 6 months. He prayed again, and the sky poured out rain, and the earth produced its fruit. Then he prayed again and asked for God to kill him. Dumb. Number 2, he was depressed. And depression is a terrible thing. And we know of some people right now that are dealing with depression. It's a serious, very serious thing. And it's not the kind of depression where you say, oh, cheer up, things will get better, sun will come out tomorrow. We're talking about clinical, chemical depression. Jeremiah, I believe, suffered from that. Spurgeon, we know, did. Jonathan Edwards confessed that he suffered from periods of what he used to call melancholy. We know D.L. Moody. Great men of God are very prone to depression. Terrible depression. The higher you are, the further you have to fall. And Elijah was flying high until he crashed and burned, following a great victory. Tremendous letdown. Number 3, I believe he was just plain out exhausted. I mean, he ran 100 miles. Emotionally drained. So juiced up, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot. Verse 46, 25 miles back to Jezreel, 100 miles back to Beersheba. A full day's journey into the desert. This is a bad time to make a decision when you're tired, when you're vulnerable. By the way, you know, that's why a lot of groups used to meet anyway, late at night. Cults meet late at night. The Nazis in Germany, Hitler knew this. He had all of his rallies late at night at the end of a long day after the German people had been working all day. They were tired. They were run down. They weren't thinking straight. They were tired out. Their resistance was down. They were easily persuadable. People are easily manipulated when they're tired. He was lonely. He says in verse 10, I've been very zealous for the Lord, and I'm the only one left. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life away. He was foolish. He was depressed. He was exhausted. He was lonely. Number 5, he was idle. The Bible doesn't say it, sorry. All right, next to that verse it says, God helps those who help themselves. No, the old saying says, you know, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Now he's sitting here under a tree. He's not ministering anymore. He had just had a great revival, and there was much more work to do, but he wasn't back home doing it. He was sitting there under the tree feeling sorry for himself. He was discouraged to make such an irrational request. He didn't really want to die. Like I said, if he did, he would have stayed put. You know, there's 3 people in the Bible that asked God to take their life, prayed to die. Elijah, Jonah, and Moses. Thank God none of their prayers were answered. None of their prayers were answered. Isaiah 40 in verse 30 says, even the youth shall faint and be weary. Young men shall utterly fall, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength and mount up with wings as eagles. They'll run and not be weary. They'll walk and not faint. Even the youths. Even the youths. Elijah fainted, but he was also fed. What did God do for him? Well, number 1, he allowed him to rest. He gave him rest. Jesus said to his disciples frequently, come away by yourselves. In Mark chapter 6:31, he said, come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while. For there were many, many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. That's why God gave us Sabbath. Now, the Jews observed the 7th day, the Sabbath. We celebrate the Lord's Day, but you need to have built into your routine, into your schedule, a regular time of rest. Some downtime. In the Army, we talk about getting on a sleep schedule. Protecting that time. You need to rest. Number 2, God gave him some sympathy. Look at verse 10. He said, what are you doing here, Elijah? He said, I've been very zealous for the Lord of hosts. Forsaken you. The children of Israel have forsaken your covenant and torn down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. Verse 14, the Lord said, Elijah says again, I've been very zealous for the Lord God, the host of Israel, because the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant and torn down your altars and killed your prophets, and I alone am left, and they seek to take my life. The Lord said to him, go and return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive from Hazael as king over Syria, anoint Hazael as king over Syria. God listened to his grief. God listened to his complaints. You know, I believe God is more willing to listen than we are to tell him our problems. He gave him fellowship. He reminded him that he wasn't alone. He gave him some good news. He said in verse 18, I have 7,000 in Israel, all of the knees of which have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth which has not kissed him. Well, where were they? They sure were not at Mount Carmel, were they? Maybe they weren't saved yet. Maybe God was talking about people that he had, and here's that word again, elected, chosen, that weren't even saved yet. God says, I've got many. He said in 1 Corinthians to Paul, I've got many in this city. In Acts chapter 18, talking about Corinth, he said, I have many in this city. He said, I'm with you. No one will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. He gave him something to do. He gave him some work. He said, go and quit whining and get back in the game and go and return to the wilderness of Damascus. Anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, shalt thou anoint to be a prophet in your place. You see, life is going to go on. Life has got to go on. Then he fed him again 2 times in verse 6 and verse 8. He's fed by an angel, just as Jesus was in the wilderness. You see, there's a very, very practical side to revival. All too often, people are looking for something emotional, ecstatic time. Emotions run high, and they can just as easily hit bottom, and we can crash and burn. That's what happens when we seek revival for revival's sake. We forget that revival is not an end in itself. Just like the fire wasn't what they needed. The rain was what they needed. But the rain wasn't what they needed. What they needed was the nourishment that came when it started to rain again and things started to grow. And that was all preceded by the fire. But when we get caught up in the fire and the big display, we miss the practical side of it. It says in chapter 19 and verse 8, and here's God's answer. He arose and did eat and went in the strength of that meat for 40 days and 40 nights. You see, all the strength that is supplied to us by our gracious God is meant for our service, not for wantonness or boasting. This is what Spurgeon said. He said, when the prophet Elijah found the cake baked on the coals and the cruse of water placed on his head, as he lay under the juniper tree, he was no gentleman to be gratified with dainty fare, that he might stretch himself at his ease. Far otherwise, he was commissioned to go 40 days and 40 nights in the strength of it, journeying towards Horeb, the mount of God. When the master invited the disciples to come and dine with him, and the feast was concluded, he said to Peter, feed my sheep. Further saying, follow me. Even thus it is with us. We eat the bread of heaven that we may expend our strength in the master's service. We come to the Passover and eat the paschal lamb with loins girt and staff in hand, so as to start off at once when we have satisfied our hunger. Some Christians are living on Christ, but are not so anxious to live for Christ. Earth is a preparation for heaven. Heaven is a place where the saints feast most and work most. They sit down at the table of the Lord and they serve him day and night in his temple. Revival's not a party. It's for the greater glory of God and the expansion of his kingdom. Maybe that's why revival is so hard to identify and define today, because there were 7,000 that were not at Mount Carmel. It's not about numbers, making a name for ourselves. Elijah prayed in chapter 18 and verse 36, O Lord, let it be known today that you are God in heaven, and I am your servant, and I have done these things at your word. And answer me that this people may know that you are the Lord, O God, and you are turning their hearts back again. It's not about us. It's not about a big show. It's not about a big party. And so God answered, and he graciously fed Elijah. Chapter 19, verse 11. He said, go stand by the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind rent the mountains and broke the pieces of the rocks before the Lord. What a great display of the power of God, right? No, God wasn't in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake. No, God wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake, a fire. The Lord wasn't in the fire. After the fire, still small voice. You see, they looked out across the sea and they saw a little cloud rising up. A little cloud. But in that little cloud, there was lots and lots and lots of rain. The fire brought the rain brought the fruit of the earth. The fruit of the earth gave strength for service and for life. We've talked a little bit about the Great Awakenings in America. The first Great Awakening resulted in America's colleges being built. And believe it or not, Harvard and Princeton and Columbia and Yale, William and Mary, were all started with the express purpose, and you can read their charters, to provide for a literate people and a literate clergy so that people could read the scriptures for themselves. How far we've fallen. The Second Great Awakening came, resulted in the missionary movement. William Carey, Adoniram Judson, Luther Rice, Hudson Taylor. David Livingston, David Brainerd, Lottie Moon. Millions upon millions of souls were saved by these great men and women of God, all inspired and converted during that time of the Second Great Awakening. And there was a prayer meeting revival, 1857. What came out of that? The abolition movement, the elimination of slavery, the salvation of thousands and thousands before they went off to die fighting in the horrible, horrific civil war of our nation. Hospitals were started. That was the big thing. Hospitals came out of that revival. In 1900, the revival that came resulted in a great campus missionary movement. C.T. Studd, Billy Sunday, the establishment of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. Later on, groups like Campus Crusade and the Baptist Student Union came along, Navigators. The emphasis in that one was on the college campuses, college students. It was a little cloud, but how much rain was in that cloud? Despise not the day of small beginnings. I'll give you an illustration. What happened in Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost? 3,000 souls were saved and added to the church. That was cool. What happened in Acts chapter 9? One guy got saved. One guy got saved. His name was Saul of Tarsus. He became Paul the Apostle. He wrote most of the New Testament. 3,000 got saved. Over here, only one. I'll tell you a story. In the early 1900s, there was a young boy on a Sunday morning playing stickball in the alley of Chicago. And two elderly women came walking along and saw the boys playing, and they said, "Boys, would you like to go to Sunday school?" They went in and asked their parents. Parents were not particularly religious people, but they said, "Sure, take them." They went to Sunday school. I don't know what happened to all those boys. I know one of them was saved. He was my grandfather. My dad, his son, became a pastor. Now, I was talking about him yesterday with Brother Lanny. He asked, was he a pastor? I said, no, he was called into ministry, but my grandma was adamantly opposed to him being in ministry, and so he reasoned that if God had called him, he would have also called her, so he became a faithful layman his whole life. He was the head usher of the Moody Church. And unlike so many ushers today that pass the offering plate and that's about all, he organized all the ushers, and they went out and they preached revival services in Lincoln Park in Chicago and at Pacific Garden Mission, and led thousands, literally thousands of people to the Lord. When he died, Warren Wiersbe preached his funeral and said that he was the godliest and best friend a pastor had ever had. The front cover of the Moody Church Bulletin that week featured a biographical sketch of Gilbert Andrews. That's never been done for any other person in the history of Moody Church. But he had a son who became a pastor, and that pastor had two sons that are pastors today. And so here you are, under the ministry of the grandson of that young boy that was led to the Lord by those two ladies who were faithful and invited those boys to Sunday school. One of the greatest stories of all time began with a shoe salesman. I mentioned the Moody Church. July 1st, 1885, Edward Kimball felt the leading of the Spirit to share his faith with a young shoe salesman that he knew. He was nervous and he vacillated and unsure, but he talked to the man. Finally, he mustered up the courage. And there in the back room of the shoe store, he led his young assistant, D.L. Moody, to the Lord. Dwight Lyman Moody became the greatest evangelist of his generation, but the story didn't end there. Several years later, a pastor of a well-known church and a well-known author by the name of F.B. Meyer heard Moody preach. Meyer was so deeply stirred by Moody's preaching that he himself embarked on a far-reaching evangelistic ministry. Once when Meyer was preaching, a college student named Wilbur Chapman accepted Christ as a result of his presentation of the gospel. Chapman later employed a baseball player who had been saved at Pacific Garden Mission to help him prepare for an evangelistic crusade. That baseball player was Billy Sunday of the Chicago White Stockings, which is now the Chicago Cubs. In 1924, a group of businessmen invited Billy Sunday to hold an evangelistic campaign in Charlotte, North Carolina. Which resulted in many people coming to Christ. Out of that revival, another man was saved by the name of Mordecai Ham. And in 1934, in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mordecai Ham had a crusade. A little group of Christian businessmen had been praying and during the Depression became greatly concerned about the spiritual moral decay in their city. And so they called on Mordecai Ham to come and preach. The ministers in the city were skeptical of this type of meeting and they declined to participate. So they were disappointed, but they still felt God wanted them to do something. And so they called Mordecai Ham, and he came and preached and spent a few days preaching there. 29 people responded at the first invitation. They fasted and prayed. And as the men grew stronger, they prayed that God would be pleased to send revival to the city. That time proved to be a blessing. In the months following, similar meetings were called. 2 of those meetings were held at the farm of W. Frank Graham, who was a dairyman, a devout churchman, was very concerned about his own sons. William, who was a teenager who had been rebellious and needed to get right with God. Out of many repeated times of prayer, the men felt led to sponsor the evangelistic meeting, and they finally got Reverend Mordecai Ham to come and preach. Many difficulties were encountered in getting ready for the meeting. It never really did materialize, but the men persisted in their prayers and labors. Finally, in the fall of 1934, the Charlotte Crusade began. William was invited by the older brother of his best friend, Grady, Tom Wilson. The last night of that crusade, both Tom and Grady were saved. You may know T.W. Wilson and Grady Wilson, 2 of the greatest Southern Baptist evangelists of the last century. Surely you know William, their friend. And it would have been something to really know that Tom and Grady Wilson had been saved at that meeting if it hadn't been for the fact that William Franklin Graham was also saved at that meeting, who went on to become perhaps the greatest evangelist of the last century. And millions of souls have come into the kingdom under his preaching. And now his son, Franklin, continues that ministry. And on September 22nd, 1997, while Julie and I slept, utterly heartless, helpless, heartbroken, depressed and discouraged because we were childless, 400 miles away, our baby was born while we slept. God is always at work. Despise not the day of small beginnings. One of my favorite quotations of all time was written in the diary of King George of England on a summer day, July the 4th, 1776. This is what he wrote in his diary. Nothing happened today. Nothing happened today. Rather than settling for a display of fire or seeking a great movement, we ought to let God be God and trust him to hear us when we pray and to respond in his perfect plan, in his perfect way. You see, revival often comes in various shapes and varieties and sizes. Our purpose for the last couple months has been to instill a vision that we as a congregation might devote ourselves to prayer, and that our prayer might be, Lord, revive us again. Revive us again, that your people might rejoice in you. Isaiah 64 and verse 1 says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens, that you would come down, that the mountains might shake at your presence, as fire burns brushwood, as fire causes water to boil, to make your name known to your adversaries, that the nations may tremble at your presence. When you did awesome things for which we did not look, you came down. The mountains shook at your presence. Lord, do it again. Lord, do it again." Psalm 85:6, "Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you? Lord, you said in your word, I will pour water on him who is thirsty and floods on the dry ground. I will pour my spirit on your descendants and my blessings on your offspring." Lord, pour your spirit on this church. Pour your spirit on us. Do it again, Lord. Do it again, Lord. However you see fit. The Lord wasn't in the wind or the earthquake or the fire. But after all that, there was a still small voice. Maybe that still small voice is speaking to one of you here today, saying, "Brother, it's time to pray. It's time to get up in the morning and start to pray." Some of you have loved ones that are in spiritual need right now. Maybe they're lost. It's time to pray. It's time to come to this altar and pray. It's time to share the gospel. I remind you where we started, Micah 5:2, "Thou Bethlehem Ephratah, though you be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose going forths have been from of old, from everlasting." The Lord wasn't in the wind or the earthquake or the fire. After that, there was a still small voice. There was just a little cloud coming up out of the sea. Just a little cloud, the size of a man's hand. But how much rain was in that cloud? It's been said that anyone can count the seeds in an apple, but only God knows how many apples are in a seed. Father, you said you would pour water on him that is thirsty. We are thirsting for you this morning. Come and pour your spirit on us and your blessings on our children. Will you not revive us again, that your people might rejoice in you? Would you bow your heads with me?